German to Main Street, and then kind of exploded across the world. But if you imagine that period where there wasn't internet and there wasn't all the communication we got, a few books arrived in South America, and they took this, they looked at these pictures, and they took this idea and ran. And Carlos is maybe going to challenge me on that. Villanueva, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, started off doing kind of colonial Spanish architect, and obviously one day he got a magazine with a picture of a core building, and you think, shit, this is a whole new world. And I think it's really, there's two lessons from that. And I think modernism almost came to home in South America because it met two things. It met environmentalism, because it had a challenging climate where modern architecture worked particularly well, but also it met landscape. And I think modernism until that point had no idea about how to situate buildings on sites. That was an extraordinary experience for me, even though I had seen it, as I say, in '69. I didn't obviously register it then. The other thing is, I think it brought home, and this is the crux of what I want to talk about today. I think in working abroad, and it's relevant to all today's, certainly the projects that are abroad, you have to kind of proportion your project, your proposals, to the socio-economic political context. And I think you also have to proportion your ambitions to a particular context. That would be the same in the UK, but I think even more so working abroad. If you like, as an office, we always try to push the limits fairly hard, but I think it's that ability to decide how you're going to measure the degree to which you can challenge the conditions and proportion the project correctly for its climate, for its culture, for its society, for its economics, for its ability of the local construction industry. So that is the sort of premise I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start off by just showing you some of this sort of the way in which this idea of modernism was taken and run with. Just extraordinary set of buildings. Whatever the political associations of Villanueva was, and that's actually that's a badge on a leg of a piece of the furniture in the School of Architecture, where everything, right down to the tables, was designed by the architect. Most beautiful studios. So that was a picture on one of those metal legs. You could do a course in architecture based on this. This is the Central University in Caracas. Every building is a masterpiece. Every building is different. Every building contains a piece of work by the likes of Calder or whatever. It's just an extraordinary. And what's fantastic about how it's used, these public spaces, these corridors that link all the different buildings, every one of these canopied walkways is different structural idea. Cantilevers, in concrete, you would never persuade any engineer with all the computers in the world to do, but they're used for dancing classes, for additional classes. Sorry, I've done that one. Bookshops. Important woman architect, not often known, in Brazil. Fantastic house. This guy's another genius, another Venezuelan genius, probably very difficult character. This is a project he did while he was a student, overlooking Caracas, with that view underneath the vault. That's the dance floor on the right there. Again in Caracas, extraordinary structures. So, that was my title for today. It actually comes from a very particular experience. We got involved with, Richard got a visit from what's his name, the ex-mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who said, you have to go over to Caracas. And Richard's sort of in the business of sort of any difficult project, pass it over to me. He said, you've got to go over to Caracas. So I went over to Caracas and met the mayor. That's Caracas. That's the coast where you land at the top. You can see the airport, Maracaibo. And then you've got this incredible range of mountains that goes to, I think, 2,000 meters plus. So you drive up this extraordinary highway, and then you drop down into this chaotic city where 70% of the population are living in informal settlements. And the biggest ones are, 900,000 people living on a hill. And we went to see the mayor, and he had this idea. He wanted us to build a bus station. Seems fine. They needed a bus station. And actually, the full story is, as we were leaving, having talked about it a little bit, as we were leaving, he said, well, I'm just going off to a meeting, which is one of the Chavista kind of meetings. So I sort of said, well, I'd like to go. So I sent her a venture. He said, that's fine, but we're going by motorcycle. I said, I had a scooter in Madrid. I thought that's fine too. Although the engineer I was with had never been on a motorcycle in his life. But it's not, you don't drive it, you ride piggyback. You ride, as they say in Spanish, like a packet. You arrive on behind the driver. So we went off to this meeting, and we went into this enormous auditorium they were about to renovate by Villanueva up in a neighborhood called the 23rd of January, which is a sort of Le Corbusian development. And I had a tie on and a suit, and I quickly realized, I walked in, there's all women, just about, all in red t-shirts, saying, with that sort of fist on it. And I was sort of trying to get my tie off and slip it into my pocket. And the meeting ended, this has nothing to do with the lecture, by the way. The meeting ended with the mayor doing a fantastic, impassioned, very, very articulate speech about the power of urbanism and presenting us in the front row. So, these gentlemen, estes señores, are here to help us improve Caracas. And then they all get up and they say, they started singing, and it's hasta la muerte, to the death. And I turned to the engineer, who was Spanish, and I said, look, don't worry, that little bit, the hasta la muerte, is not in the contract. But the next day they said, well, we'll pick you up and we'll take you to the site, which is where the white lining comes, because again, the motorcycle rider comes to pick us up. And so you're hanging on the back of the motorcycle, and I'm just checking, yes, he's armed. He's got a gun on. And we took off down a highway like that, white lining, which is the American expression of driving down the middle of the traffic, solid traffic, down the white line, 90 kilometers an hour, with absolutely no protection other than just, got shirt sleeves and the helmet on, borrowed helmet. And we went out to this site, which you can see there, which has got this extraordinary piece of this race course with beautiful grandstands, all built by an American architect whose name has slipped my mind, but it'll come back to me in a minute. And the biggest geodesic dome outside the United States. And as you can see, it sits in a kind of valley, little end of a valley. In fact, it's called La Rinconada, which means the corner. So it sits in a little valley where the city is just exploding on around it, and it has two or three really big informal neighborhoods on either side, kind of no-go areas. So we drove out and we looked around and said, well, you can put the bus station anywhere here, anywhere in this area. And there you can see the existing structures. And actually, we went back with a sketch. This is not the sketch. I haven't quite found the sketch, but it's very similar, where we did a quick sketch and said, listen, we can put the bus station here, but what we think you should do is make a park, protect this green space, because in 20 or 50 years, this will be a major important park for the city, because by and large, it's avoided invasion. And the mayor took this and apparently went to Chavez. And I mean, there's absolutely, we can talk about the politics in a little while, because I think it's worth talking about. But apparently the message that came back was, yes, we must protect the views of the sky on the sketch. I'm thinking, crikey, either that's a really clever, really, really clever, or completely crazy comment. So we developed a master plan which sort of said it's like a series of kind of almost like orange skins, where we focused, we protected the hillsides up to the ridge line, so you did almost nothing up there, and then as you got closer and closer to the centre, there were more and more interventions. And basically, series of drawings, series of presentations, where we situated the bus station, and in fact, they later on wanted some stadiums, and picking up on the local kind of political jargon, we described it as 3 axes. Axes of education, axes of sport, axes of transportation, los tres ejes, which is sort of representative of that. And that the idea was the bus station met at the intersection of those 3 things. And along the way, they asked us to do a football stadium, which we did, a very beautiful football stadium with a roof inspired by local artists. And that's just some of the drawings of that, some of the models of that. But of course, this is a little video we did to describe those components. That was the educational axis, which is all the blue buildings, where they were converting a lot of the buildings they built for the race course to educational uses. They've got they've got a kind of equivalent of Open University. Protecting the green space, because obviously the topography is pretty spectacular. Anyway, I'll go on to the next slide. And then I'll explain this video when we've finished. I'm sorry about the resolution, but the music, I have a better resolution if it doesn't have the music, and I prefer the music to better resolution. I should say, any emails I ever send out from the office, I never put the words Hugo Chavez on, knowing that Homeland Security will forever forbid me from entering the US. It doesn't seem much, that video, nor do these photographs seem very much. But when we got these videos, because in the interim, Venezuelan economy has obviously gone horribly wrong. Chavez had died. Maduro had come with all the consequences that seem to have flown from that, and we weren't working on the project anymore. But when we got these pictures as a team, actually people were almost crying, because the project was very ambitious. We thought it was fantastic in many ways. But it seemed to us that what they'd done meant more than many other urban design projects we'd achieved, because they'd taken the master plan and they'd just gone on and got on with bits. And so the pictures you see, for example, of the plants are actually nurseries they've established up in the poor neighborhoods, given the power to the women, and they've grown the plants, and they've taken the children and they've planted the plants down in the park. So this is, when I said at the beginning, I'm going to talk about disasters and successes. This was the big success, is that we tried a process. I think we proportioned the project correctly for the situation we found. We entered into the spirit of participatory discussion, so we had extraordinary meetings with people coming to it, which was in itself very educational. I think we came up with a good plan. But like many urban design projects, because they require money and they require time, it had fallen, in a sense, we thought it had fallen on its face. In fact, it continues to go. And so those two projects you see, the bicycle path, which I, frankly, as a bicyclist, wouldn't dream of cycling down, it looks far too dangerous, and the water park for the children, are amazing when you think about the impact on those, some of the poorest neighborhoods in Caracas is a tremendous success. So I'm now going to talk about, now I think I come back, I just remind you, I think it's a question about how you proportion your process and your solution to the social, political, cultural, economic construction capability context, but also how you mediate the level of ambition. And in a sense, I think I said it right at the beginning, as a practice, and there's some, Mike is here from the office and some other people, I think we always try and be pretty ambitious with our projects and test things that might not otherwise be able to be tested. I think when you come to a place like Caracas, you have to kind of mediate that to what is possible, and that's a difficult process to see, as it turns out, they came 2 weeks ago to ask us to continue work on the bus station. God only knows where the money's coming from. But obviously you're never going to deliver a building that sits comfortably in one way against a side, the Lloyd's building or the cheese grater or Channel 4 as a kind of beautifully mannered, beautifully constructed piece. So I think that's for me, certainly working within the practice is always a difficult line to follow. The next project we're going to talk about is one we did in India about a year ago. Andhra Pradesh, there was a big state called Andhra Pradesh, they divided into two, and one half of it, which also called by Andhra Pradesh, didn't have a capital. And obviously, capitals in the Indian subcontinent, there are some extraordinary precedents. It was I'll just flash forward to the precedents. Obviously, you've got New Delhi in itself, which is a masterpiece of its own kind, imperialistic for whatever it is. You've got Chandigarh, and you've got Khan's work in Dhaka, and he is sort of publicly known as the father of the state. So it was a difficult act to follow. Again, we were in two minds about whether to do it, because we've never worked in India, and I think there's high levels of corruption, it can be complicated. But it seemed to us, the brief, and those are extracts torn out of the brief, that there was something about vibrant, democratic, participatory, inclusive, reflecting the character of the Indian democratic system, which chimed with the work that we had done in Wales and the work we'd done in Bordeaux law courts and Antwerp law courts, where it was all about opening up what is otherwise a rather obscure process to public scrutiny. So Wales was all about getting the people up so you could actually get right up inside and look to see the legislature in action. And similarly, Bordeaux and Antwerp were all about turning what is traditionally hidden behind a kind of Romanesque or Roman portico, all sealed behind doors, open that process up to in the sort of notion that visibility is good for democracy, it's good for anti-corruption and so on, that it seemed to us that there was something that we could build on. and Ivan and I, who did this project together, we'd done Wales together, we'd done Antwerp together. We thought it was something that we could take those notions further. But actually, I think this is a case where our ambition sort of exceeded could be exceeded the appetite of the client. So it's got a rather sad story, I think, this, which gets worse by the day. These are just things we had in the competition presentation, final competition presentation. That was the brief, which was, as it were, New Delhi, formal axis, with all the things arranged down the side and the key buildings at the end of the axis. And our first was moved to say, well, the first thing is, well, we're going to get rid of that kind of imperialist nonsense, and we're going to make it asymmetrical, and we're going to put the buildings on one side and a public space on the other side. So you immediately create two things. You create an accessible space, which becomes rather an internalized park only for the people involved in government, but becomes a public park. And then you also bring, as it were, you start to address this question about how do you make the Indian democratic process as transparent and inclusive as possible. So that was a kind of theme that runs through all of this. So that was the basic master plan. I mean, there's some interesting symbolic issues that we had to address to do with religious symbolism of axes and so on. As I say, you're always working to a different set of rules. But in a sense, that was the master plan. And this sat in a slightly strange master plan. That was the master plan for this government complex. That sat in a wider master plan for a whole new city. So it was very much like Chandigarh was an entirely new city. What's interesting for us is that the inheritance of the Raj is that is all of those buildings in our master plan, which you can see on the right, are either the four key symbolic buildings, or the administrative buildings, or the housing. So it's in itself is a huge construction project, and as you can see, it sits on the edge of a rather beautiful river. So I'll just flash through these, but you can see from the titles the sort of general direction we were going, and interestingly enough, we talked a little bit about the Maidan today in some of the crits, sort of creating a public space in the tradition of India, the Gymkhana, obviously the relationship to water, the fantastic creating spaces, and this is where I come back to the question of proportioning a solution. We were very much looking for a language we felt was appropriate for the culture. And right down to the architecture, where somehow colour and art and so on could enter into the architecture. And obviously, all the festivals are an incredibly important part of the culture. So the notion of a people's path and the park alongside it with a series of public spaces that allow you to celebrate those activities was very important. It was an overwhelming master plan. I mean, I should say our excuse for not winning was partly we were literally overwhelmed by the task, being not a particularly big office, because it required you to do the whole master plan, as you can see, which is a sizable piece in itself, but also design the three key buildings, which are one is the High Court building, in the middle is the Secretariat, and at the top, right at the top of the axis, the Legislature building. So you had to do those in some detail. The other aspect, and I think you can begin to see this, we were creating a master plan which actually was quite low buildings, quite narrow streets, no emphasis on vehicular access. So the parking was always, access of cars was always restricted through into the block, with parking quite carefully constrained to what is the left-hand side of your screen, so that it encouraged as you moved into the scheme, it encouraged basically pedestrian movement. So that, you know, at the moment, the judge kind of lives and then gets in a car and drives 3 miles to the High Court. It was to actually come up with quite a revolutionary take on what a modern city might be. And we knew when we were doing this, you're running the risk of them saying, but you've just given me a bit of old-fashioned India. I want, you know, Western iconic buildings. So there was a lot of work on making all of that work in terms of all the functional requirements. Incredible brief to fit in, which took one person 2 months to figure out what the brief actually was, and finding enough flexibility in that program so that it could grow with time and different grains of movement. Hierarchy of public spaces all the way through. On this side, you see actually quite small private gardens, through to courtyards related to the administrative buildings, through to the People's Path down the centre, and then the People's Park on the right-hand side. And then, of course, the design of the public space, bearing in mind, mysteriously, the site they picked for this was is a serious floodplain. So you're actually building buildings out of that floodplain, which took some understanding. Come to grips with the local plant types and so on, and equally important, pursuing a kind of low energy solution to all the buildings. So these are only interesting in the sense that this is a section of the office buildings where you're intentionally making a courtyard which is exposed to the sun, which gets hot, which drives the movement of air through the buildings. So, you know, which is slightly against your logic. So you're tinkering with the temperature changes across the, you know, because you're dealing with a master plan, you can start to create a kind of topography of temperatures which allows you to derive a climatic solution for the individual buildings, and similar approaches for the housing blocks. So that was the master plan. So that was sort of part one of the project. The second one was to go through these core 3 buildings and the courtrooms. I mean, again, each of them, I think, overwhelmed by the scale, because I can't remember exactly how many, but it's 3 by 15 courtyards. So it's courtrooms. So it's a huge, huge building. You know, when you think of Chandigarh, I think it's probably about 8 courts from memory, and that's serving 2 states. So, you know, again, how do you, on the one hand, we've got this idea we want to make this process transparent, but then also, and accessible, but also how do you take this number of courtyards and group it together in a sense that you can find your way, and it can be serviced, and the judges can get through, and the prisoners can get their route, and the public can get their route. So each of them presented a particular set of challenges. So, I mean, in this instance, a very simple notion that there was I'm just going to go back here one way, because if you like, in that first sheet there, it describes the basic move for each of the buildings, and this will be the theme reported, where the People's Path, this sort of access that connects all these buildings, actually purposefully goes through the middle of the court. So it's a little bit, Antwerp, it was at the end of the street, and you go up, and the street continues into the building. This will sort of say, well, we did that, let's do something else. Let's take the public street right the way through the building. So it was basically you then create a building with 2 levels, where the upper level, as I say, the street runs the way through, and which is that level, and then from that you get this cluster, these flowers of courtrooms, so that you go into, as it were, more intimate settings. So it's not quite such a frightening process, with the main court in the centre with its appropriate symbolic axis, I should say, and then back to the previous slide, which I had these in the slide wrong order, the circulation routes from all the legal administrative buildings through underneath to a lower level, we're then giving the access, both vehicular and pedestrian, for all the judges and so on. So you're working on 2 levels, but there's always a degree of transparency between those 2 levels. And then again, in each of them, an environmental approach, which pretty much is common to all of the three buildings, which is an outer skin that, if you like, keeps the heat off, and then an inner set of volumes, which then are treated. Each of the spaces treated within that protective, beneath that protective skin. So you can see construction, some degree of construction drawings, models. So that sort of gives you a clue of overall structure of how we described each of these buildings. In the case of the Secretariat building, as I say, the Secretariat building sits on one side of the axis, with the administration building sitting on the other side of the axis, without that underground connection. So all the administrators have to leave their office, walk down to the street. They can't get in a car. They have to walk across the pedestrian street, as it were, and go into the Secretariat building. It's a very intentional move to create this point where Indian administration justice, which has its reputation for corruption, is somehow made much more aware of the people who, on behalf of who they're administering or ruling, whatever word you want to use. So, and in this case, you can see that the notion was that the roof then actually also covers that root, so that root, it creates a kind of loggia in that roof, which in itself encourages occupation. And that's what you can see on the left-hand side, and then inside there's a sort of repeat of that idea of a route, because there is some degree of public access to committee rooms and so on, at the, which takes place at the lower level with its own internal route. So legislative building, which is the last of the three buildings we had to look at, then explores it in a slightly different way. This has, as I think explained on that drawing, it has a kind of symbolic position at the end of the route, so you see it down the route, but just before you get to the building, the route veers off, and in fact, in the wider master plan, then joins a river walk along the river, with all the importance that the river and water has to life and everything else, but then creates basically the equivalent of a gate, which overlooks the main public space of that building. And I'll explain that in a little. I think this video explains that. So you've got, again, two-level arrangement with the legislators on the level below, and public access given to the upper level from the gate. So you can go in and, like in Wales, see into the legislative buildings, or you can meet your politician at that level, but you're meeting them in full view. Your meeting areas are in full view. Or if you don't have the permission to enter the buildings, you can actually just sit on the gate and watch this activity going on. So then a series of plans that describe all the different routes that you've got to achieve to meet the brief, all the areas. Again, same notion of a big roof covering the space, protecting the space from the solar gain and rain. But in this instance, the underside of that roof was reflective, so you're always, even when you're sitting in the chamber, you're through the reflection, you're aware of the outside world, so you can kind of never escape the sense that the public is out there somewhere. All the environmental studies to try and make sure that it's as naturally ventilated as possible, and so on and so forth. Models. So, this one doesn't have such a good story, because a good ending of the story, because we didn't win the competition. In fact, they awarded it to Mackie. And you can go on to YouTube and look at, there were three brothers, one from us, one from Mackie, and one from B.V. Doshi's office. B.V. Doshi's retired, but his son, I think, has taken over the practice. And you can see them. And you can see that what the others gave them was, as it were, a Western image of what a modern capital should look like. and certainly didn't address, I don't think, the issue, the central issue, which is how do you make government accountable to electorate in what is the world's most extraordinary democratic experiment. You know, you've got a huge population of voting with all the logistics and you know, it works and it doesn't work. It's an amazing event in an amazing culture. So we lost the competition. Very sad, very disappointing. Lots of people in the office worked incredibly hard on the project. But as it turns out, this is the really sad bit. As it turns out, about 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, we got an email saying, congratulations, we are in the process of finalising the fee arrangements for the project. So, very interesting. So we called up, it was not meant for us, the email, it had been sent in error. And it had been awarded to Foster's. So, very sad. I think I come back to I've yet to call them, actually. I do mean to call them and ask them how they do it, because I'd like to know. But I come back to what I think the challenge of working abroad, which is how do you correctly position the project? How do you proportion the project according to what is possible? And I think we touched on that in some of the projects today, and I think it came to a head in the discussion about Cairo. How do you mediate these various, the context in which you work? And as I said, for us, it's also, I think, a fundamental judgment we always have to make. And Mike will remember Pompidou, you know, that was a real, you know, long shot. You know, I suspect, Mike will correct me, I suspect they probably didn't think they were going to win. It was such a crazy idea. And I think the art that we play, the game that we play by the rules, he said in a very loaded way, is try to find the right socio-cultural political approach, and then at the same time try to be ambitious but not to be so ambitious, because in the end we want to build projects, because that's where you learn, that's where you might be able to make a big impact, like the park, which was a kind of long shot, but it's really made a difference to 2 or 3 really crummy neighbourhoods, and given some employment and given, you know, the children something really fantastic, for example. Or in the case of India, where I think really we could have done something pretty spectacular in terms of the democratic process. So that's the end of the lecture. As I say, it's partly about working abroad. It's also about our experience of urbanism, which continues to be difficult, and we kind of fluctuate doing urban design projects or not, because they are very difficult. As I think everybody who presented today discovered, you've got to cover an entire huge range of issues. And that really brings me back to Madrid. You know, the client is very keen that we do it. My own feeling is it's impossible. Why would we be able to solve it when 20 years of other people trying to solve it is never going to work? And I do think it's partly because we don't really know what tools to learn. And that's compounded with, and I think I may have mentioned this the last time I talked here, compounded by the fact that we're working in a context which is governed by the time frame of the politicians, which is every 5 years or 6 years, whatever your administration is, whereas urban design problems are 20 years, 30 years. And if you like, the analogy I always use, if you take Bilbao and Barcelona as two of the, you know, Barcelona was the model in the 70s and Bilbao was the model in the 80s or 90s. they were working within stable context. Barcelona just had one party ruling forever, which has its problems. And Bilbao, they actually quite intelligently took the urban design aspect and depoliticized it by creating Ría dos Mil, which was a kind of, to some degree, autonomous body, which was able to think beyond the 5 years of the next administration. So in the case of Madrid, the client, having been burned by this 5-year cycle, says, I don't want to get involved in the next elections, therefore you only have till the end of this year to solve something we haven't solved in 20 years. So it's, I think the only thing I can say of that is you're going through a learning process. We're always going through a learning process. Every project you learn something different, but it's quite exciting. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I should have said a condition of, I mean, I very rarely give talks, but they make you think. They give you a moment to sort of be honest with yourself and reflect on projects. Precondition is I have 3 questions at least. Well, 3 or maybe 4.
Yeah. So
you have to work as much as I do. So if there's any questions, they can be on anything.
we need to think of questions. While you're thinking, let me ask one very big question.
I'm expecting one from Carlos as well.
Carlos is digesting
Yeah.
what to do. But the very biggest point you make is the need for you to engage in the socio-political economic condition of the place that you're working in. It's easy to say that. It's extremely difficult to do that. So you're coming from a practice in London, you're suddenly in a very different context, whether it's Venezuela or India. How do you set about doing that? Do you always insist that you have local people on the ground? Do you partner with local practices to give you the inside track? Or do you do a lot of research, which inevitably will be a bit abstracted from the actual political reality of the condition you're working in? How do you position yourself?
Well, I think I'd answer in 2 ways. I mean, I think that one of although it's not obvious, I don't think it's obvious from the outside, one of the strengths of the office, I think, is that it very much engages itself in process as much as in design. And I always say that in terms of urban design, you've got to spend, design is difficult enough, but you've then got to design the process. So you've kind of got 2 projects to do in parallel. So I think that's sort of in our makeup. But I think also you have to be open to the smell, as it were. It's a kind of tactile thing, which is why, I tell the story about saying, I'll come along to one of your meetings, because it was one way for us to gauge what their process is. But I think also, you're right, you have to partner. I mean, again, we believe in collaboration. I mean, it's a collaborative, internally it's collaborative, but I think also externally it's collaborative. And it's a question of finding people who can help you. But there's no hard and fast rule. I mean, in the case of this is also a sad story. In the case of the Venezuela project, we're working with the local team of the mayor, who are, incredibly well-educated, well-informed middle class, bleeding to death at the moment, bleeding to death. So, I think you have to enjoy doing that. So I suppose that's the third piece of work, is how do you construct the team? So, in Bogota we're doing it one way, Caracas we're doing it another way, Madrid we're doing it another way. I think it's not believing there's a kind of recipe which you just apply to each solution. You've kind of got to make it up as you go along. And that's why I say I think it's exciting. And it's good because it's humbling.
Yeah, and it's a continually sort of dynamic process. It's not a
think
fixed
so.
model, and that's what's really interesting about it. So, can we now open up to
You've had time to
questions?
think about
You've
your
had time to
questions.
think. I've given you a little time to think. Who would like to start with a question?
Well, it's not really a question. It's a comment on the project in Venezuela, which I know as little as you do, actually. I mean, I left in 1968, but I have all the connections there. I think one of the things that's important in terms of what you're saying is that, in a sense, to respect what can be achieved is important. And the idea of the international idea that you can just import things from one place to the other. So we look at a model in Padua or a model in Antwerp, and we say, oh, we can put that in Africa. It's completely insane. And maybe the minor success in the Venezuelan project is to do with the actual political and economic situation at the time, in which those communities were empowered. So it wasn't just the people that you met on the motorbike trip. Actually, when you meet La Señora Ramirez or whatever, who comes from this place that looks like hell,
Yeah.
she's totally organized, and they all talk to each other, and they all have actually something that they want to be involved in the process. And that's quite interesting. So maybe at that scale of the bus station and so on, in which people are definitely part of it or engaged with the process, is quite different to this huge task of designing a capital city, which goes into this architectural realm of, yes, you have to meet the, you have to do as well as Lutyens at least, so, but it has this sort of tremendous dimension of government and so on, which actually may be something like when you work, when you can actually communicate to the environment that you're working in, makes a huge difference.
And I think in India, we weren't able to communicate that. And either they weren't listening or, one ends up blaming oneself. We didn't express it in a way that suited they didn't, fitted what they want, how they could absorb the information. I'm not describing that very well, but you're absolutely right. And actually, I'll tell another story in that I don't want to verge into the political discussion because it's obviously very complicated. The only thing I'd say that the mayor of Caracas, who was vice president of Chavez at certain points, I'd been given lectures in the National Theatre there with him, and he was able to talk for an hour with no notes about the power of urbanism. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary. But one of the things I went to him with was the handing over the keys of a flat. They embarked on this thing called Mission Vivienda, which constructed, 750,000 houses and flats in 2 years. Some of them awful, some of them extraordinary. And I just happened to be in the show flat, or the flat they were giving away, they symbolically were giving away for the television, when the person came in. And it was, they give the keys to the woman of the household because then it won't be given away for drink or whatever. And so she turned up from a, unbelievable slum, in our terms. Immaculately turned out with the 2 children, immaculately turned out, took the keys and burst into tears. I mean, it was just absolutely extraordinary. The funny part of the side is that you get the flat and you get a table and 2 chairs and you get a sort of nominal cooker, but on every wall, there's a painting of Chavez. Just in case you could forget.
Watching over you.
Yeah. So it was actually, it was a very moving experience to be part of. So, and any more questions? Not just the teachers.
No, I was just going to make a comment about the challenge that you present of trying to relate to understand, to engage with this local cultural, socio-political, economic situation, and the difficulties of doing that. And I think your 2 examples are quite interesting because in the case of India, you appear to know the way you present is that you were really trying to relate to the local culture and trying to really present something that would be much more appropriate in your view. Nevertheless, totally alien to what they wanted and their understanding of what they need. So it becomes quite a tricky thing. I mean, this question of how really to understand what is appropriate, how to relate to those local conditions. I think also the fact that you are participating in a competition, a very different engagement than if you are invited, as you were, to Venezuela, to Caracas, by the mayor, etc. Then you have a president that was romantic enough to say, like the idea of being able to see the sky, and then you go ahead, and you know, it's in a sense was a much more straightforward process, and you could probably relate to it, and also in a sense to have a quite realistic understanding of what was possible and achieving that. But I think it illustrates perhaps exactly the difficulty of relating to those local conditions. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, I kick myself in the sense that you feel you haven't been reductive enough to really describe in an elegant way and in an appropriate way exactly what you're trying to do. And again, I think we saw a lot of that struggle today, is that people are struggling with all sorts of things, but actually, you know, the question the jury kept sort of asking is, what is the most important thing you're trying to do? So I think the scale of the endeavour forced you to be kind of very broad, whereas actually you needed to be very precise. I'm not saying if we had been as effective, and I don't think we were particularly effective for a variety of reasons, and there's some funny stories there, but for a variety of reasons, all sorts of things that went wrong, but I'm not sure the terrain was fertile. And in which case, you say, well, we should have guessed that and not gone into it, which is what Foster's did. Or you trim back your ambitions. And I think that's for the office, we've always got significant workload from competitions, and we like doing them because it does force you to push the boat out a bit.
The problem is that often, to try to relate to local conditions filtered through the eyes of the local politicians,
Yeah.
you might actually end up very distant from the reality.
Correct.
This is the problem.
No, and I think, I mean, we took
I
I think we took we took heart from the fact that there was a good jury, which had architects on who you kind of rely to, as it were, mediate the message, because they're in on the discussions. I think all sorts of other things happened. I mean, as I say, there are quite funny and sad stories associated with the presentation and the interview and what happened before and what happened after, which didn't bode well, obviously. Oh?
Sorry to continue this line of staff questioning, but I recall being in an office once where I asked the question, how do you do your research? How do you organize research within the office? A very large practice. Again, like yours, with international projects. And they said, well, I guess maybe if we do it, we do it when we do competitions. And so just thinking about this conversation you've just been having, in a sense, the test of did you do well or did you do poorly? You're interpreting as, did we win the project? Where another point of view might be, at that moment where you're asking these questions, where you actually don't even know what the jury is looking for, and you don't know whether the ground is fertile for accepting your ideas. In a way, you're asking a question internal to the office. What's the office's point of view about a series of problems? Now, when you think, does the office have a way of kind of collecting these lessons, other than to let's say, address the pocketbook? And is there a way to collect your research such that you would then say, as we look back over the work that we've done for these competitions, here are the things that we would take forward again the next time?
Yeah, I don't think, again, it's not quite so organised as that, but I think you're absolutely right. I think the big kind of conceptual steps that the office have made have generally been through competitions, so that we understand that that's a risk. And I think that always is, if you like, frames what we do. I mean, I think in this particular instance, all the team, I'm not just talking about ours, but all the consultants really wanted to do the job. And, you know, in a way, that makes it more painful. You know, I was particularly interested because my father served in the Queen's Own Madras Sappers and Miners in the Second World War up on the Burma front. So there was a kind of coming home for me of going back. And that's a strength and weakness. You get emotionally involved, but that's how I think you do good projects, but you pay the price. But you're right, it's a kind of, if we had an R&D fund, I mean, it's what we always say, it's where R&D money goes into. But when they're so big, it's expensive. Yeah. And then I think I could do another lecture because we lost that one, but we won the Taiwan one, the airport, which we're halfway through the design on. There's a problem emerging, I think there's a new problem emerging for the profession as a whole, in that these projects, the requirements of what you have to produce are so onerous and so costly. There comes a point, and you know, I certainly internally had a debate and said, in Taiwan, we're right on the edge. You know, if you look at the contractual terms and conditions and what we're required to produce and what it's going to cost us to produce it, we're right on the edge of the limit of what the office can sustain. Which means, you know, as I say, we're not a big office, but we're 200. So it's not a small office. But I think that's there's a danger that all those things which historically, you know, I mean, Pompidou allowed a sort of office. How many were there, Mike, when you did Pompidou? 12, you know, to take on the biggest, you know, Pompidou in his time was sort of moon landing for architects in terms of the scale of the project. And if we're sort of right on the limits of actually thinking we can't do it, that's so slightly worrying to me as a profession. And a lot of it's just nonsense. You know, it's, you know, impossible contracts with impossible terms and conditions and deliverables requirements at the competition and then subsequently, which are just, they're not actually making better projects. In fact, the reverse there. And they're just too much to bear financially.
If I could follow on to that with one other question. A lot of what you presented tonight was about the urban scale interpreted as the agglomeration, the problems of growth, how you begin to discover the possibility of qualities when there are many things, and the challenges, proportion, and things like that. A lot of what we're trying to do with the students is to recognize that a lot of the urban qualities that we're really looking for start inside the building, and they in a sense, migrate outwards from a life. You know, we've spent all day inside this lecture hall, and we might ideally think of urbanism as beginning in here rather than being, in a sense, constrained by an exterior order. If we think about the research as being focused on how things are changing in the way buildings work, how we work together as teams, or how we teach differently, or how we imagine we live differently. Does this work its way into your urbanism? Do you learn from different parts of the practice, interior to what's going on in the education projects, the lab projects, the office projects, the housing projects, and translate that into a new urbanism inside of Rogers?
It's a very big question, that. But I mean, I think, as I say, we fluctuate between sort of sometimes throwing our hands up in the air saying we're not doing any more urbanism. It's just too difficult, and you never have any success. You put a lot of as it were, high-level intellectual effort into it, and it's not, doesn't reap benefits in terms of realising a project. But I think that dialogue is absolutely critical. I mean, in the end, I don't think it's that complicated in my book. It's all about making spaces that creates relationships between people. It might be a family, it might be an office, it might be, you know, a group of departments in an office building or whatever, or it might be, you know, the electorate and the elected. So I think it's absolutely fluid, that flow from inside and outside, which is why this one, you know, I think we underestimated the scale of the problem, because if you really want to look at it at all those scales, you have to think about the individual house, the individual office floor, and then, or desk, and how that then relates to the grouping, and how that floor relates to the others, and how that floor relates to the structure. And as I say, it came with this incredibly arcane brief, which is kind of the Raj, but, you know, when the Raj, the population was 250 million, I think when India won its independence, now it's what, 1.5 billion or whatever it is, so everything's sort of escalated. So, but I think you're absolutely right, that dialogue is fruitful for the office. And I think in the end, and for those that are not aware, we moved from our home of 30 or 40 years into the cheese grater because we're on one floor, which is fantastic, because in the end, I think it's very simple. People say, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to, you know, next time I'll try something like that. So there's it's not an organised communication, it's actually just because people see it. And so everybody's sort of building collectively. And I think that works around 200. I don't think it would work at 500. It becomes another. So we kind of said, if we move into that floor, we can't ever grow again, which we always think is good. Whether that proves to be the case, we'll see. Have to have at least one question from the students.
Who's going to be brave enough?
Come on, yeah, I won't bite.
Nothing challenging.
Come on, the brave one. Oh, sorry, I don't remember your name, from Cairo. Come on, you're brave enough. We get... You can ask anything.
I don't have a question in my mind.
Take the microphone. No?
Okay.
There are no interesting
Well,
points that
there's one more here.
There is any sort of questions in your mind. Everything you said is absolutely perfect. There's nothing to discuss. Really?
Some of you could even argue.
Yeah, exactly.
Things he said.
We're here to be challenged.
It's a very similar question to what Larry and Hugo just asked you. Okay, is this better? So what I'm going to ask is very similar to what Hugo and Larry just asked you about how you obtain this knowledge of the host cultures that you visit as an office. For instance, you just spoke about that, some religious reference with regard to that corridor in Andhra Pradesh. What would convince you that that is a more important reference than something else, maybe, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, most things have a very easy answer. At one level, the way we sort of decide what jobs we do is a Monday morning meeting, and people just say, I'd like to do that. And that, by its very nature, suggests that you either know something about it or you want to engage in it. So I think at that level, it's no more complicated than that. In that particular instance, there was a part of the brief that required you to follow Vashtal rules. Of course, there are no rules. It's kind of open to interpretation. So you can seek professional guidance too. And in the case of Andhra Pradesh job, we were working with a big team, which in itself brings problems, you know, but it also enriches the project. So, in that sense, it's no different than I think you've all had to do in your various things. You have to go out and read books and study up, and you know, we travelled out there. They did a proper tour, and
Well, my concern was that,
And you can get it wrong.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, so if I were an Indian, for instance, I would think that maybe, this was not probably the most important thing in that you would have considered. You could have considered something else maybe. So that's my concern.
Yes, I think you have to expect when you go into these different countries,
Yeah.
there will be a lot of resistance to an outsider. Absolutely.
Well,
And I mean, in
not
Taiwan,
just
for example,
resistance,
they were definitely looking for best international practice,
yeah.
but there's an enormous resistance kind of throughout the entire process. So,
Right.
what the hell do you guys know? We do it this way. And you say, well, elsewhere we do it like this. And you've got to pick your battles.
Mhm. Yeah.
Some you just have to say, well, I'm not going to bother with that one.
I don't know if it's a final comment, but there is one thing that is still in my mind, which is related to the, let's say, conflict between realism and ambition. Because at a certain moment you said that we cannot be too ambitious, no? Because if we want to get through with the project. And you also showed these projects by Khan in Dhaka, you showed also Chandigarh and so on. So I believe at that moment, there was, the ambition was just high. So what do you think is the difference, or is it related that it's just an exceptional moment in time when that happened? Is it related to exceptional people? Or is it rather related that, as you also mentioned, the profession is getting more complicated, so that we cannot just achieve this ambition anymore?
I think that's a large part of it. I mean, I think, I don't know a great deal about Dhaka and Chandigarh, but I think you'll find in the end there's a very close relationship between the client and the architect, which is what we did secure in Venezuela at actually all levels. And interestingly, in India, we did with the jury, but not with the politicians. Obviously, just came in over the top. I think the complications of there are so many levels now of sort of project managers and administrators and whatever often between us and the client that does mean a lot of that ambition gets taken out, because everybody wants to show what's the precedent, how can you guarantee that it'll come in on time, on budget. And so I don't think it's a question of not being too ambitious. It's just sometimes you just say, well, we won't be able to be as ambitious as we should be, and therefore we should probably not do it. And maybe India was an example like that, to say what we're going to suggest at the moment is not right.
I just have to follow on, but just, you've referred to the Pompidou a few times, and, we've discussed it as a course on numerous occasions. And, it's hard not to look back on it as being the most beautiful answer to a question that people were having trouble to formulate even at the time. The level of ambition now appears to be very great. And, it stole the moment. So it's almost as though the answer is, it has to be an office of 12 people and one of them is Mike, or something like that. So you can be that ambitious without being concerned in some ways. It's a very interesting kind of
Well,
problem.
I describe that in another way, and in a way that's, the only reason why I've kind of pursued this job in Madrid is because I think it's a question of the time being right. It's kind of the stars are aligned, and that happens. It's a kind of fleeting moment. It's a bit like those games in the fun fair where there's just a moment where you've got that possible shot, and I think it may be that for Madrid. Another of our colleagues, Marco, one of the original founders, Marco Goldschmidt, used to describe it as kind of being like one-man bandit machine. You know, you've got to get the 5 pairs to line up, and they don't often. You know, one is, do they own the site? Do they have the money? And do they have the ambition? I mean, I'm not sure exactly that's what he said, but it's pretty much that. And, you know, you can keep doing that for a long time, and most of the occasions, the 3 pairs won't come up. So I think it's also a nose, trying to develop a nose for that.
Just to say politics once more. I think that it's interesting that there is a correlation to political ambition. So when one brings in the political issue, not the social economic issue, but actually the political issue, is always seen as a negative thing. But I think a lot of the great projects, and possibly, you know, projects that we would object to now for being imperialist and so on, were part of an ambition. Reconstruction after the war was an ambition. You know, the Churchill Gardens estate is an amazing estate. I mean, there was a vision of the future which was actually politically based. I think in Venezuela you found a moment of change with the Chavez revolution and so on. It's all gone horribly wrong, but there was a sense of people wanting to change something. And I think a lot of the other projects, I think you're very precise in describing them. They become deliverables. It's just a sort of almost an engineering exercise. Can you do it quickly enough, fast enough, and for enough profit? And maybe at the level of engagement with, let's say, foreign projects and so on, or working abroad, maybe the stars do come together, but I think therefore that conversation on political, which we had earlier on with the students, I think is really critical, because what that moment of change is, I think is really dependent on what barriers can be pushed with the project.
Yeah.
So that if there is an ambition there, then you can bring ideas.
And I think it's also having the guts to push.
Yeah,
I mean,
and the other one, which I think is also very brave in terms of working abroad, is that is very, I think it's very important for one always to say that one only has a superficial understanding of a situation, but I think one also has a very clear understanding of the situation because you're not in the situation. Exactly. So I think if those things come together, political ambition is a very strong thing. So I think politics is really important to this stars coming together.
Yeah, and I think you have to, you know, you have to stick hold of the big idea and be prepared to risk it all, gamble it all, and go and fight for it. You know, because I mean, the meetings next Saturday, we're off to Taiwan again. You know, we go to meetings where there's literally 60 people in the room, none of whom actually have any other objective than protecting their own arse. They're not making any decisions, they're just making sure they're not making a decision that'll get them into trouble. So the people that have had that political ambition are nowhere to be seen, and you have to be prepared to go and fight it through the thing and just say no, which in, you know, it's a culture where no actually is not often said. I'll just end on this one story, because I was thinking today, when we were doing the South Bank competition, which is another failure, painful to us. What are they called? The architecture couple that invented the big wheel. Why can't I remember their name? Julia and Mark. Yeah, came to Ivan and I think Richard actually, to say we've had this great idea, and you know, and they showed us the big wheel, and we'd spent probably 2 years fighting the entire establishment, all the way up to the John Gummer, who was then Minister of Culture and whatever, who, when we went to see him about the project, we explained what we needed and why it was important. He said, hang on a second, I'll just be 5 minutes. He went out with his minders and came back and said, I can't answer that question. That is, he was so handcuffed. So when they came to us, you know, because I mean, Jubilee Gardens has been a battlefield since 1951, and it's next to Red Ken's Empire, you know, and then it's got Coin Street slung in there, and it's just got everything, you know. And they came to us, and we all, after the meeting, we said, they're never going to build that. They must be out of their minds. And it's the most important thing that's happened on the South Bank. And, you know, to their credit, they stuck their neck right out. And it was the one thing that got those 6 million that are over in Covent Garden to cross the river, which is what it needed. And then, you know, the whole thing works. So you've got to be brave.
Well, Simon, thank you very much. I think a very rich reflection and at sort of multiple levels, from the detail of particular projects through to the sort of strategic way in which both architecture and urbanism has to engage and how difficult that is to do. I think it's extremely valuable to hear your reflections on that. Can I suggest that we now move upstairs and continue discussion in the bar in a more congenial atmosphere? We've given you a good run for your money and made you answer a lot of questions. And thank you very much also for your contribution this afternoon.